EDHREC provides a ton of information when you're building a commander deck, and some folks, myself included, really enjoy using all of EDHREC's features and scrutinizing a commander's page for every single detail to squeeze out every last drop of value. But this isn't the approach that everyone takes. Sometimes what you just need is a deck list, because you want to get started playing right away and don't want to overthink all of the possible things. You just want to play commander. And luckily, EDHREC actually has the perfect feature for this too, the average deck feature. The average deck feature can be found on any commander's page, and it collects the information for the most common cards played with this commander and assembles it into a fully functional deck list for you. It's a quick snapshot that gets you started right away. So what is this video? This is Upping the Average. Consider it a supplement to the average deck list. We're going to make some tweaks to the original average deck list provided by EDHREC to help you take it from a good start to a great start, and hopefully provide a couple of quick gameplay tips about the commander strategy as we go. Let's get to it. Our first case study is the current #1 most popular commander according to EDHREC, Muldrotha the Gravetide. She's a 6-mana, 6/6 elemental avatar that allows you to play one of each type of permanent from your graveyard on each of your turns. That is sick value, so it's really no wonder that she's so popular. Her EDHREC page is full to the brim of great cards to cast and recast from the graveyard. Seal of Primordium, for example, handles enemy artifacts and enchantments, while Plaguecrafter gets rid of pesky enemy creatures. This is all great stuff. As a quick rule for swaps in this list, I'm not going to recommend anything that will increase the overall price of the average deck list. In fact, my mission is to increase the power level but decrease the price of the deck. So if you've got the cards that are really splendid for strategies like this, totally play them. Rhystic Study your heart out, Sylvan Library till the cows come home. But in general, the swaps that we make are going to be either even in price level or lower the average price of the deck. So let's get started by checking out the average deck list. EDHREC gives us a list, and I'll import that to the Architect deck building website for a full visual. Some really excellent synergies present themselves in this list. For example, Mystic Remora draws tons of cards when our opponents cast non-creature spells, which they definitely will, and Muldrotha doesn't care about the cumulative upkeep because she can just recast this thing from the yard. We can also only recast one creature per turn, but some of these other enchantments, such as Kaya's Ghost Form or Animate Dead, give us some other stuff to do too to help maintain our creature density on the field. Still, there's room for improvement here. I have 3 general observations about this list. First, there are too many spells. Second, the type distribution for our permanents. And third, the win conditions. Let's go through those one at a time. Up first is spells. There are just too many instants and sorceries here. Muldrotha wants cards that she can reuse and reuse and reuse over the course of a very long game. So when we make swaps, we should eliminate the cards that she can't recast, the instants and sorceries. So Kodama's Reach and Cultivate are great ramp spells, but I'm actually going to recommend a straight across swap for Farhaven Elf and Wood Elves, which can be replayed over and over with Muldrotha for further value. We also have the spells Grisly Salvage and Villainous Wealth. Cool cards to be sure, but Muldrotha wants something that she can bring back, not just one-time effects, so I'm slashing these too. What do we replace these with? Well, glancing quickly through this list, I see Plaguecrafter and its friend Fleshbag Marauder, which force people to sacrifice creatures. A great thing for Muldrotha, who can just cast these again and again to keep other people off of their valuable creatures without much impact to her own strategy. However, I'm not seeing Merciless Executioner, their little brother, who totally belongs in the list with them. Let's make sure he joins the family. In addition, Lightning Greaves is here to help protect Muldrotha, who definitely needs protecting, because killing her removes access to our entire graveyard engine, so we gotta make sure that she sticks around. To that end, let's make sure that we add in Lightning Greaves' little sister, Swiftfoot Boots, to accompany the Greaves and help keep Muldrotha protected. Now, I said there are too many spells in the deck, but Muldrotha players actually have been eliminating a lot of spells from her diet already. Which is why we don't see the super popular removal spells like Putrefy, Assassin's Trophy, Reality Shift, and other forms of spell-based removal on her list. Instead, Muldrotha relies upon permanents to fill this role, like the Plaguecrafter that we mentioned earlier, or effects like Acidic Slime. I point out this removal issue because I think it actually has a major impact on the way that we can improve Muldrotha's average list. Without access to those popular instant spells, she's missing out on some much needed interaction. Many Sultai decks play those Plaguecrafter and Acidic Slime cards already and have more removal spells on top of that, and I think that means that we need more removal in this list too. This brings us to point number 2, type distribution. We don't want to add more creatures that act as removal. We can't play 2 creatures in one turn with Muldrotha's ability, so what we have to do is diversify our permanents. To that end, Muldrotha will love it if we can play these in her deck. Lignify and Kenrith's transformation will nullify enemy commanders beautifully, and can be cast from the grave along with something like a Plaguecrafter or a Chupacabra to help us get rid of 2 permanents at once. In fact, let's go one step further and also throw in Control Magic, which I firmly believe is a sleeper hit in a Muldrotha deck. I mean, who wants to cast their commander onto a board when you have any of these enchantments in the yard, ready to threaten at any moment? Alright, now what about board wipes? Muldrotha players are using 2 repeatable wipes on average. Nevinyrral's Disc and Pernicious Deed, which can be replayed to help reset the field. But I think we've got access to one more option that will help us a lot too. Phyrexian Scriptures. This saga can buff up Muldrotha, annihilate every other creature in play, and then go to the graveyard ready for us to cast again without destroying Muldrotha. And we don't mind losing any of our other creatures because we get to replay them from the graveyard anyway. Plus, when we replay this, we can actually make another creature into an artifact creature so it survives the wipe too. This is a cheap and repeatable wipe that totally helps improve the average list. Alright, well that's 4 things we've just added, which means we need to make some cuts. So what are we tossing? Well, I actually see a few cards that I'm just really not thrilled by, and they're mostly in the self-mill category. Sultai Ascendancy, Stitcher Supplier, Tamiyo, the role that these cards filled is almost exclusively to help fill the graveyard. That's good with Muldrotha, technically, but here's the problem. Muldrotha won't always be in play. She's a removal magnet. If we fill our yard, but can't keep Muldrotha around, these effects don't actually provide us with much card advantage. The average list has a lot of other self-mill effects that already serve these functions, and have other functions too. Vessel of Nascency digs for other cards, Satyr Wayfinder finds us lands, Underrealm Lich sorts our draws out, Worldshaper fills the yard and ramps us when it bites the dust, even Perpetual Timepiece can fill the yard and then later save it from a potential exile effect. And actually, since we're moving away from some of these creatures, I'm actually going to recommend removing Sidisi Brood Tyrant as well. She can fill the yard, but she might not make us that many zombies. We have enough stuff that fills the yard already, so we'll be okay without these cards, and Muldrotha will be happy reviving multiple types per turn, rather than having a high density of just creatures. Speaking of which, I don't see a lot of artifacts here that we can revive over and over and over. I see a lot of artifacts that we can play once from the graveyard, and then which stick around in play. But it really seems like Muldrotha is aching to play a land and a creature and an artifact and an enchantment in one turn whenever possible. This average list seems to let her play a land and a creature and an enchantment, but not very much on the artifact front. We do have some artifact creatures that count towards this, but they're few and far between, so I think we actually really need to bump up the artifact section a smidge more, because even just 1 or 2 repeatable artifacts that can come in and out of the graveyard multiple times will give us a lot of punch. Shout out to Commander's Quarter's signature card Wayfarer's Wobble, a splendid choice here. I'm also going to recommend a card that I think a lot of Muldrotha players are already familiar with, Executioner's Capsule. I suspect that many Muldrotha players started with this in their initial pile of cards to play, but found themselves cutting it. In fact, I'm going to postulate that the same thing happened for another card I want to put here too, Seal of Doom. Not an artifact, but I still think it's worth using here. To explain why though, I'd like to compare these to a card I'm going to recommend that we cut. Shriekmaw. Shriekmaw is good. You can evoke it every turn from the yard to destroy a non-black, non-artifact creature. The thing is, I think that's just good. I don't think it's great. For one thing, it takes up one of our most valuable Muldrotha types to replay, creatures. We also have a lot of other creatures that we want to replay that provide us with a lot of value, so using our creature spell for the turn on removal is less desirable than using it on stuff like Glenelendra Archmage or a Tatyova or a Gitrog monster. More importantly though, this is sorcery speed, and it has 2 restrictions, non-black and non-artifact. Capsule and Seal don't have the artifact restriction, and they can be used at instant speed, which helps them perform 2 of the most important functions of removal in a multiplayer game of Magic. To Rattlesnake, threatening other players so they don't attack you, and to allow for potential political deals, removing a threat for someone else in exchange for temporary truces. Muldrotha has almost no instants in her deck, so I think we're hungry for these effects, and even if they cost 1 more mana than Shriekmaw, I will happily pay 1 more mana to destroy an oncoming attacking creature instead of just destroying a creature at sorcery speed. We're at 102 cards now, so we'll have to make some cuts before we move on. You know what, I'm still a little iffy on these creatures. I know that Coiling Oracle is beloved by many, but it's not beloved by me in this deck. Maybe if we weren't 3 colors, I'd like it more, but it's very color specific for a 2-drop. Believe me, I played Simic back when this card was first printed. I've cast many a Coiling Oracle in my day. Commanders like Yarok and Rune and Cassetto should totally run it, but it's less thrilling for me here in Muldrotha where we have so many other valuable creatures that we want to recur and can only pick 1 at a time. Additionally, Dryad of the Elysian Grove is nearing $10, and it has a cool ability, fixing mana, playing extra lands, But Muldrotha can still only play 1 land per turn from the yard. Even if we can play extra lands per turn, Muldrotha has a 1 land restriction. Since it is an enchantment creature, we can cast it from the yard as Muldrotha's enchantment for the turn, but even so, it's still $10. And I'm not sure I want to spend $10 on this effect. I'd much rather put that money towards an all-star card that's going to help us win the game. And that brings us to point number 3, win conditions. The average Muldrotha deck is sorely lacking in win conditions. We have ramp, we have card draw, and we have a handful of good creatures that will outlast our opponents by being constantly replayed from the yard, and which can technically nickel and dime our opponents in combat, but there just isn't a ton of stuff here to truly close the door on a game and clinch victory once and for all. I think there's a good reason this is the case, too. EDHREC collects data from tons and tons of decklists, and Muldrotha players far and wide have clearly converged on her best value engine cards, but they've taken their desired methods of victory in different directions. Some might use landfall, some might use big life loss effects, and some might use +1 counters, and so on. But they all share the same core engine spells, which is why we see a high preponderance of those value engines in the average list, while the win conditions are a little more hidden. Therefore, it's our job to find some of those good win condition cards and get them into this list to help make sure you can close the door and win those games. We should make sure to base our win conditions on Muldrotha's primary game plan. She is a master of outlasting the opposition. She outlives board wipes and combat steps by constantly returning her cards to play, so she can whittle her opponents down over the course of several turns until they all run out of resources, and then land a win condition to firmly shut the door on the game. So what do I recommend for win conditions? First up, one of my pet cards, Sir Conrad the Grim. Conrad deals damage to opponents when creatures die and when they go to the graveyard by being milled or discarded, and he even deals damage when creatures leave our graveyard, like when Muldrotha casts them. Conrad can even mill cards when we have extra mana, giving Muldrotha more fodder. He pairs beautifully with the suite of Plaguecrafter spells already in the deck, and even if he perishes, Muldrotha can get him right back to start again and win the game with death by 1,000 cuts. Second, Mindslaver. Muldrotha can't usually afford to cast huge spells from the yard every turn. We just won't realistically have enough mana to cast a 6-drop artifact and a 5-drop creature and a 4-mana enchantment in every turn. It's just unrealistic, it's way too much. This is why most of her spells tend to hover around 3 mana. Mindslaver is a little different though, because it's the only spell we need to cast in 1 turn. Muldrotha plays a long game, which means we'll have a substantial amount of mana when we drop this, and can repeatedly take over one other person's turn for the rest of the game. This is a great card from Muldrotha that will just ruin everyone else's day. And third, EDHREC Kraul Death Priest. Muldrotha has an army of 1/1 and 2/2 elves and Muldrifters. EDHREC makes them no longer that. We're sacrificing so much stuff in this deck that we will be drowning in counters. Evolving Wilds every turn, Bauble, Sakura Trap Elder, heck, you get a ton of counters when you play that Plaguecrafter. EDHREC makes himself into a huge beater, your army of tiny dorks into powerful threats, and it even turns Muldrotha lethal too. EDHREC also has amazing synergy with the Persist creature Glenalendra Archmage that shows up in the average deck, because the +1 counter and the Persist -1 counters will delete each other, allowing us to use the Archmage over and over to protect our board. There's one final thing I'd like to address for our final round of cuts and swaps, and that's the deck's budget. I just recommended EDHREC, which is not a budget card, but which I do think actually increases the power of the deck in an appropriate way. And I don't think that's actually the case for some of the other pricey cards that we already see. They might not be necessarily worth investing a lot of money into for this deck if you're looking to build it right from the off. So let's take a look at some of those cards now. We've got some great stuff here. Demonic Tutor, Entomb, Cyclonic Rift. So look, if you've got these, play them. But if you don't. The average deck shows us what a lot of people are doing with Muldrotha, but you don't need these cards to make her good. In fact, she blooms on a budget. Up with the average, but down with the price. So we toss some of those pricey cards, but I also want to attack the lands. We don't need $60 fetch lands or $20 Urborgs. Panoramas will serve us just fine, and can be sacrificed and brought back with Muldrotha. Speaking of which, a very powerful land, Strip Mine, makes its way into Muldrotha's average list too. This is really good with her because she can delete a bad enemy land, recover the Strip Mine, and do it all over again, whittling away enemy resources without losing any of her own. That's great, but it's also like $20. The card Tectonic Edge is less than $1 and it will serve us just fine. And as long as we're not playing those expensive fetches, the card Ramunap Excavator needs to be addressed. Ramunap Excavator is a backup for Muldrotha in case she's not in play. But if you don't have those $20 or $60 fetches in your deck, its applicability is much more limited and largely redundant with Muldrotha already at the helm. In fact, notice how it disappears from Muldrotha's page when we choose the budget filter on EDHREC. If you have fetches, feel free to keep this one in, but without them, it's just not as spicy because Muldrotha already gives us this ability. But on the subject of lands to bring back, a super defensive land that folks should absolutely play more of in Muldrotha is the card Glacial Chasm. I won't necessarily count this as a land because it doesn't tap for mana, but it's amazing. Glacial Chasm prevents us from attacking, that's fine, and forces us to sacrifice a land when it enters, that's okay, Muldrotha gets it back, and we also have to pay 2 life on our upkeep, and then 4 and then 6, to keep it around. So what do we get in exchange for all this downside? No one can deal damage to us! And just like Mystic Remora, if the upkeep cost gets too high, we can let it die and bring it right back. So here we have our final list, which I hope folks will find packs a bit more punch than the original average deck list, while also being a substantial decrease on the deck's budget. A link to the list can be found in the description with a list of the cards added and the cuts placed in the maybe board. So let me know what you think of these swaps and any other cards that you would also recommend to help improve this commander's average deck list too. And let me know which commander you'd like to see on the next Upping the Average video. Thanks so much for watching.